This is the December 2022 version of the 4th Division's second Saturday layout tour. And today we're very pleased to have Tom O'Hara from Bellingham, Washington. And I'll just let Tom go ahead and introduce himself and then give us his presentation.
My name is Tom O'Hara. I was a physics teacher in West Texas, 20-something 100 miles from here. I retired there and we were looking for a place to move to. My wife was still employed at the local hospital. So I actually ended up, once we found this place, moving up here 2 years ago in November with my mother, my grandson, and 3 cats. And my wife came up periodically to visit until she finished her contract the following summer. And now we're one big, we're a pretty happy group. My introduction to railroading is a little non-traditional. One, I never had a Lionel train. Nobody in the family worked for the railroads. I had an older brother that had a Lionel train and played with it some, but I was never interested in it. There were no tracks near my house. So actually, I didn't get into trains until I was in graduate school, picked up a magazine in the store and looked at it and said, this is kind of interesting. Right after that, I was drafted into the Army in Tacoma, Washington, is where I started out, and went to the local model railroad club there. Didn't do much with it. Got out of the Army, went to graduate school. And once I was in graduate school, I dabbled a little bit, but graduate school seems to want you to do school work, not just play with trains. So anyway, it's time to move on to the presentation. I titled it that way because, well, some of the layouts really weren't much and some of them were decent. Anyway, I titled it this way because essentially I've had 7 layouts in a weird way. The first one was when I was in graduate school. 4x6, I had read H.O. Railroad That Grows cover to cover. So a lot of you probably remember that book. That layout, as I say, is a tribute to ignorance. It ran over and under. I packed as much into 4x6 as possible. Okay, so I was in graduate school for a while. And when I finally got out of there in 1978, I moved to Midland, Texas. It's oil country, it's flat, it doesn't have trees unless you plant them there. And I started building a railroad in the garage. You can kind of see how the door is open here over on the side. I built a U shape, had no particular plan. I added walk around throttles at a time when we were just hooking them up to power packs. I learned about walk arounds. I learned about homosote, O'Hara switches, which I much prefer. Well, I did Atlas at first, but the Atlas switches were not what I wanted, and I moved on to O'Hara. I acquired Dynatrol at some time in this 8-year span. A lot of you probably remember the pre-digital, the analog control is the best way to put it. I learned about Katie couplers. I say real twin coil because I got away from the Atlas, those little things that mount on the side of the turnouts, and moved on to the ones that mount under the table. They were twin coils. They worked fine for me. I expanded because I found out that working in a U shape, which was like going around like this, was fun for me, but it wasn't for anybody else. So I actually added a closed circle out here across the front so I could run trains around in circles. James Mims was a long-term model railroading buddy that I had. His name's going to pop up several times, but I met him in '82, and we were buddies for 35 years running trains. So it's a good long-term relationship. I did this for a number of years, and then along about 84, 85, I started building things in my backyard, including a workshop and a train room attached to the workshop. And Midland, Texas is about the size of Bellingham. But Midland, Texas didn't have hardly any model railroaders. It's a transient society, oil business. People come, people go. They don't tend to build layouts. And in the time I was there, I probably only knew half a dozen serious model railroaders, and I was in Midland for 40 years. It's not like around here where every third person's a model railroader or something like that. I'm just showing you a few pictures of what I was doing at the time. A lot of you will recognize Campbell buildings. I tried a few of the plastic buildings. The corners didn't close. I didn't think much of them. So I moved on to, I think this is Railway Design Associates, but there's a lot of Campbell stuff in here. And I still have all of them. There's a fine scale miniatures sawmill I built. Unlike the people around here, I had no particular reference. I wasn't going for a railroad from this town to this town. I wanted to imitate it. I was just freelance. I was just having a good time building trains. I was just having a good time. I don't know anything else to say. Okay, so this was the one I built in the backyard. I designed it way back on Third Planet. It was a pretty good design in general. My workshop was over here. This was an extension into the workshop, but all the rest of this was in a building of its own. We left one place. Sonora was an off-screen, what you now call a staging yard, only it didn't have hardly any tracks. Came into Divide, went to Stockton, I'll show you all this, Sierra Vista, and off to another hidden place. So trains could come in, switch, go out. And then while they're here, they could do some traveling off to a mining area and off to a logging area. But basically, it's a very simple design. It doesn't look like it when you look like this. But basically, it started underneath. I did have a hidden 3 tracks. You'll see this in another picture. Went around the room, all underground. I realized that I was about to cover it all up. So I went back and tuned the track and tuned the track and tuned the track until it was the best track I've probably ever laid, because it was all going to be underground. And it was going to be very hard to get to. Essentially, you started off at Sonora, which isn't named after Sonora of California. It's named after Sonora Caverns of Texas. So you came into Divide, switched a few industries, and then left. And you went off to Stockton, where there was a stock Mims, and into Sierra Vista, switched this, and went out. And you could reverse this. So that gave me any building that wasn't on the railroad, like a mill that I needed, things could go off to the mill in the next place called Pinedale. So backing up, I could switch out of here into Angels. And this was my logging area. I had 2 sawmills, a small one and a large one, here at the camp. And out of here, you could switch up to Buck Hill, which was the mining area. And there's a mine on this side and a mine on this side. So lots of switching, but notice I still wasn't going for a locale. I wanted a flavor. I wanted mountains and logging and pine trees, but I wasn't attached to any particular towns or any particular railroads. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I just didn't have a reason to do it. So I was all freelance. I was working on my backdrop painting. It's a firm believer in backdrops. This predated all these fancy backdrops that people have now. But basically, I was teaching myself to paint backdrops, and everything on this railroad I was teaching myself because there weren't other people around. There's my quote hidden yard. It was very small, and it was not terribly convenient because I left this hole here so I could reach in and set up the train. And then it switched out and switched back, and so, well, you can see how it's developing. I got into rock work and worked on that, and trestle building. And again, this is all self-taught because occasionally I went to a convention, but it's not like nowadays with YouTube where you can see so much information I could not see. So I built only 4 or 5 scratch-built buildings in my nearly 50 years of model railroading. I just never really became attached to that. So if you like scratch building, fine. There was always a building that was good enough for what I was doing, since I wasn't trying to imitate a particular building in a particular town. turntable. I needed a wooden turntable. I wanted the style, so I built that. And I didn't have plans. I just built it. Not a very good way to do it, incidentally. Reason for going from here, where there's almost nothing as far as scenery and so on, to this, is to point out how much the whole thing improves when you start adding details. And I strongly, when somebody tells me they're building a 2,000 square foot layout, I tell them, okay, but don't try and build all the track at once and anything at once. Build yourself at least one or two little scenes as you go, so that people who come to visit will see where you're going with this whole thing. Particularly people who aren't in the railroads, they come in, they don't know what it's going to look like, and all they see is plywood, some track, but when they see a scene, they say, "Oh, this is what's going to happen." Okay, get going. So I just encourage people to get as much stuff into a scene as possible, as soon as possible. That's a Woodland Scenics kit. I stick to kits pretty much. That's Campbell, mine. Another view of the same mine. Getting people into the scene, nice little old car and a truck into the scene, it just makes it look like something, even if the rest of the room is unfinished. With backdrops, you've got to find what you want, and that makes a lot of people happy. They can find the one that they need. I wanted one with a stream, some aspens, and the railroad, so I painted it. And I also tell people that my painting was really pretty much three-dimensional, because I painted, didn't like it, painted over it, didn't like it, painted over it. And eventually I got to a point where generally I was satisfied with it. This is two-dimensional. The three-dimensional begins right here. This is a beaver on his beaver dam. And I had another beaver out in the water, except he was headed for the dam. Anyway, that's something that I could do with a backdrop, is I can add features to it that I can't find on a photographic one. Another thing about photographic, take this as an opinion. I find that if your photograph is perfect, which they are, and your scenery is very shabby, that's not a good word, but I can't think of one, just not quite up to the photograph, there's quite a discontinuity when you go from the foreground to the background. Whereas if you paint a decent backdrop and have decent scenery, they blend pretty well. And that's really the philosophy that I've taken over time. Woodland Scenics, Campbell, I added an extra spout onto it because I'd seen the one up in New Mexico and thought that's cute. So I did that. I also recommend that you look along your track. We all use gauges and straight edges and so on, but there seems to be nothing like the eye to tell you if the track is pretty straight, good enough straight, or particularly on a curve where you've got a nice gradual curve and you don't have any jumps in it. I don't have any right here to show you, but I just find that looking along the track is a real way to find your how well you're doing it, how well you're doing the track. I didn't even notice until I took this picture how I didn't pay any attention. I had noticed how wide the gaps were. At this time, part of my track was hand laid. I mean, I used a KD spiker for a while, didn't like it. I used little spikes for a while. I found out I'm not a hand laid track person. I used kits made by BK Enterprises for the turnouts. And they turned out, that was not intended pun, but it happened, to have very wide spaces here for the points, which didn't bother me when I looked from the side, but did bother me when I looked from the end. Oh, well, a little late to worry about it, because I'd have to cut a whole bunch of these little bars to a wider. Anyway, nobody ever complained about it. This is code 70 track. excuse me, on this railroad, I was playing with code 70. I also tried code 55 and code 40 up on some sidings. I found out what a nightmare it is to get your ballast good with code 55 and code 40. Once again, just something I didn't want to deal with. So code 70 is my rail size of choice now, and will continue to be. I'll still use 83 in hidden sidings, just because generally I can get it cheaper. I can buy Atlas or something. Watch your spaces. When I did this, I wasn't paying attention to the fact somebody's got a stand over here. Fortunately, the person over here has got some room, and the person over here has got some room. And you notice I've made one person bigger, because it always seems like somebody's chunkier and you got to maneuver around each other. So if you're going to have back-to-back yards, think about it just a little bit, because you're going to constantly be bumping each other, particularly after you add something like cup holders or car card boxes or something like that. I got kind of lucky that I had made this unintentionally wider. I made this dent in like this so I could reach in there, and that turned out to work pretty well. But these guys ended up kind of staying where they were and not moving a lot. And then somebody else could be over here working this stuff, and somebody who's running the through train can be moving along this side and so on. So 4 people worked this fairly well, and 4 was about all I ever had in Midland, Texas, because like I say, they just weren't railroaders there. Often these were visitors who came from out of town and dropped in, and due to my casual approach to dispatching and car cards and so on, they could pick up a throttle and run it pretty quickly without a lot of explanation. So I got some operators, but I'd had the good sense to take corners off of rectangles. And you should do the same. People bump into them, lose a little skin, you'll lose skin. Well, fortunately, unfortunately, I got divorced in 99. While I was there, I was also doing, my other big hobby is woodworking. I was making furniture. So this only got a small part of the garage, and I really didn't do much with it. It's, as you can say, it's 7 by 5.5. It was fun to switch it. That's what it was about. But I never did anything except wire it, lay the track and wire it. I did make it modular so they could be taken apart. That was very intelligent of me. And it's about this time that I got into DCC. Now, I'd actually got into it in the previous layout, but I was just hooking it up and learning about reversing sections and stuff like that. So I started DCC. I got away from, let me back you up for just a second here. I went from Dynatrol, which worked very well, to DCC while I was still using this layout. I hadn't added any sound yet. I thought, who needs sound? They'll just confuse you. Well, that was, and I don't know if you noticed, but there's those modules, and these 3 went on to the next railroad. Now, the next railroad, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just showing you how I mounted my, I was using Easy DCC. Some of you are familiar with that. There's lots of brands. At that time, I had real good reasons for why I picked that, but I still consider it a good system. But it was the only one around with small handheld units. Nowadays, everybody's got small handheld units, so that's less of an important point. I did build them on a little rollout panel, so I could set stuff and then hide it away underneath. Now, where did this come from? Well, I got remarried and we moved to the country. And the country's halfway between Midland and another town about the same size called Odessa. And 10 miles in between was a number of little, what they call ranchettes, 2.5, 5 acre. We had 10 acres. My wife wanted horses. We had a couple of horses. I learned more about horses than I ever want to know. I had an empty barn, 1,200 square feet, put up 2x4 walls, sheetrock, insulated sheetrock, did put in electricity. and made a third of it into a train room. Unfortunately, after I got it built, I found it really worked okay, but there were things I didn't like about it. I built it, it got clear to the track, wired. I was running it a little bit, but for several reasons, I did not pursue this all the way. I mean, I just stopped. And I'll get to some of those reasons in a second. Notice I put a thing about didn't like tortoises, and I don't mean the ones that crawl around. I mean the ones that everybody's using nowadays. On the preceding layout, I was doing a lot of experimenting. One of those things was in switch machines. I'd been using twin coil snap action switch machines, and everybody was saying, oh, they'll tear up your turnouts. Well, I'll answer that question. No, they don't. But I thought, well, I'll try these slow motion switch machines. There was the tortoises, there was the Switchmaster, which is a little black can that turned. And there was, like a great big slow motion motor, which is what it is. And there were several others that had a little motor mounted on a screw assembly that moved back and forth and slid an attachment which could move your turnout back and forth. Well, that last layout I had some of each of those. It had some snap action, it had some tortoises, it had some, all four of them. And I kind of settled on tortoises. And then I did this whole layout in tortoises, lots of tortoises. The aisles got smaller. I'd only made them 2.5 feet. They were down to about 2 feet. That wasn't working. I was getting older. Other people were getting older. We're starting to develop midriff bulge. And I had things like this. I had these two lined up together. And I even had this where you needed to operate it from both sides. So I was putting duplicate controls on this side. Now I'm going to tell you about James Mims, my buddy, and I'll show you his railroad in a second because it's relevant. We had been railroading since '82. And when I say railroading, I mean nearly every Friday night for 25 years about this time. I would say 40 Fridays a year, we'd gotten together to run trains. I had learned that running trains is partially because you're running trains and partially because of the people that you're with. And I think that second reason is more important than the first. And he and I just dovetailed. We got along great. We modeled the same era, but we also had philosophical matches on many things. So we'd talk before and after the train running, but anyway, the point is he was about 25 years older than I was. He was starting to slow down. I was doing the maintenance on his railroad. And I really liked the railroad and the layout and so on. And so I was spending more time there and very little time on this one. It's one weekend I went in and took this railroad apart. And I had several more reasons, but I'm not going to go into them. And I saved the tortoises, I saved the turnouts, I saved the wood, I saved some things. I lost a lot of track and wires. But what I ended up with after that is basically an empty room with some diorama on it. And as he was slowing down, I was working on his railroad. One night he said, Tom, I've got a railroad and you've got a room. Why don't you figure out how to move it? I went, oh, because we really liked the railroad and friends came to town that knew his railroad and had for 40 years. And I said, well, I don't know about that. So he talked to a moving company who looked at it and said, you get it apart and we can move it. But they didn't want to do it. He talked to a couple of handymen that had worked for him and didn't want to do it. So eventually I took over the project. And I think that you'll find this somewhat interesting in that I call this a hybrid layout, the one that's about to appear, and 14 by 28, so it's decent size. But I was trying to continue the tradition. I wanted to keep running his railroad. I mean, that was really a part of it. And I had done a lot of work on it, so it was becoming mine anyway, in a way. I just photographed, I hope most of you can see it. This is built in the old style. It was actually built starting in '53. By the time I met him in 82, he'd been working on it for 29 years. It was mostly done, but he didn't crash his way through. And he only built it one time, other than a few little dabblings. It looks like a mess, but I'm going to run you through it. Start down here in the yard. How do we get into the yard? Well, basically, he kept most of his cars in the yard, which I don't consider a good way to do it, but that's what he had to work with. This room is built into half of a garage. He had enclosed, put a wall along this side, a door, and you go in the door and you walk into the railroad. So anyway, you leave this, you go out, you work the town of Midland, go into a tunnel, you work another town, go around, do another loop. And if you're not confused by now, you're one of the very few rare people who survived this little explanation. And eventually we arrived at Summit, the town. There's another mine out here, and you can see why they call them a spaghetti ball. And then all along the way, we switched cars, we had problems, we had trains that were too long for the siding, we had to figure out how to shuffle them around. Sometimes we double-headed. The day we discovered Dynatrol, where you could put two engines on the same track, we just had this silly grins on our faces saying, wow, we can double head. We can cut an engine in on the caboose. It became a different world. So anyway, we did all this all the way up and then all the way back, and ended up in the yard. But we wanted an off-world. I'd been already doing that. So I crawled under one time and found that if we went from his workbench, which is right here, put a track right here, which could be just squeezed under the layout, run all the way across the room and come out over here, we would have an outside world connection. And for the next 15 years, we ran it that way. He'd put together trains here, or sometimes he'd step aside and say, you put together a train. We'd give it some car cards, we'd send it out, it would arrive over here, arrive in the yard, and then it would go through all those convolutions that I just pointed out. And then at the end of the night, we were bringing the train back down the mountain, put it back together, send things back out, and it went off to the outside world. So whether you think of it as coming in from the east and going back to the east, or coming in from the east and going back to the west, either way, we had a connection that worked very well for us. That was his railroad. And I know it sounds like not much in a way, but those silly little problems, which we thought of as like a puzzle, we did over and over and over. And the people who came in thought they were absolutely great. And it didn't require a lot of explanation. And if they were confused, one of us went along as a conductor, worked the cards, talked about them, let them figure out how to switch the cars. And it worked very, very well it had worked for 25 years, and we were going to make it work a little bit longer. You see, it was actually a very simple thing. The outside world went into Midland Yard, onward to Summit, back down and out. Very simple in concept, but we just had a lot of fun doing it. We did have a last run. James is the man with white hair. I'm the ugly person next to him on one side. Two of our friends who were moderate railroaders, they did some, came over, and we did a last run through the room. This was in the summer of 2012. And then I started taking it apart and fixing it to move. The red lines are the room I was going to. The blue lines are his, once cut apart into 4 pieces. The challenge was moving these 4 pieces. This one was about 10 something feet long. This one was 16 feet by 5.5. And I found out later on that it weighed a little over 600 pounds. But remember, all of this was built into a room. So it was all attached to walls. and it wasn't planned to ever move. So if you removed the walls, you suddenly would have everything falling on the floor. MNW is Midland and Northwestern. That was the name of his railroad. Here's the beginning of it. We took down the skirts. You'll start to notice, and I'm going to show you in the next picture how this worked, supports that were going underneath so it could be freed from the wall. A friend of mine, Bob Weidecker, and I built a couple of long C channels, about 15 feet long, that ran the whole length of this big section. Put a bunch of girders on top of that, moved them back and forth until we could run verticals up, risers, to either his framework or to other parts of the railroad, basically his framework. And I kept doing this until I found out I could take a piece off here, cut this away from the wall. I did a whole lot of slicing along the wall in this arrangement. And eventually it's off the wall and you can see where the wall was. And you can say, and we had to take down the wall because this thing had to come out of there. It was really funny the first day that, or the first moment that I got that last piece disconnected, because I could just reach out and take that whole thing on its dollies and move it with one hand, all 600 pounds. Here's just another view of the thing. I went and got 4 little dollies from Harbor Freight to roll things on, and then built contraptions to anchor to. And this is not attached to this. I just made a C-shaped cup on top, set on there, because when we get to the U-Haul, I thought this is going to have to come off of here because we're not going to raise it 3 feet up and put it in the U-Haul. So we slid it off of here basically. Here we had to clean up the wall so we could get it out of there. This was basically moving day. So we rolled it this way, moved it this way. And this is where kind of interesting, just got a couple more pictures I'm going to show you of what we're moving there. This is what it actually was in my place. But I'm backing up now. The day we moved it was the Saturday of the 2012 Narrow Gauge Convention in Seattle. And one of the guys that helped me a lot, he had a real quandary: be here for the great move or come to the Narrow Gauge Convention. Well, he went to the Narrow Gauge Convention. So I had to find some other people to help me that day. Anyway, it's funny. The other thing that's funny is this is West Texas. In September, it's usually 100 degrees. This day, it was chilly and rainy. It was a tribute to the Pacific Northwest that was having the Narrow Gauge Convention at that time. So I just thought that was a bit of an irony. Moving on. Again, you can see braces, all kinds of triangles, so that this thing would not wiggle, and it did. It really rolled very nicely. So we moved it out. We took it to the U-Haul. We did have to lift it a little bit and slide it in. Right about here, there was a station. We took it off because we were going to tear it up. That station had been there since the 1950s. I think he said 1960, but it was right then. It was a station. It was up against the wall because this side was up against the wall. When we pulled that out, on the platform of the station were 3 people standing there. They'd been standing there for 60 years, waiting for the train to pick them up. And he had completely forgotten long ago that those people were there. This is what it looked like it was in my place. This is where he had, remember, this dated from lock control. So he ran all his switches from a panel that was like this. I wanted my switch controls to be along the side. So this will eventually get covered up in what I'm doing. But that's why there's a funny looking hole there. This is in my room. Here it is again. And you can see that it's all on, it's still on all this frame. When I took it off, I put a jack under each corner and raised each one like 1/8 of an inch because I didn't want to flex it much. Took this one apart, moved it out of there, and I put a bathroom scale under it because I wanted to know. And that's how I know that it weighed over 600 pounds, because I did this 4 times and they added up to like 615 pounds. So, and then here's another section, and the other sections behind us in this picture. If you wonder how you get a boat out of the basement, you get a train into a room by having a wall that was intended to be moved in the first place. I had taken a barn and enclosed it. Among them was a couple of big garage doors. And I had taken those doors down and put up walls. So those walls were pretty much discreet. So I could take it down. And the day we moved it, I had taken it down and we could just roll this in there. And over the next 3 days, I put the wall back up again. You can see the C-beams, you can see all these things. It really worked out pretty well, but it quite a bit of time and effort. So don't do it unless you want to. Tell you something about the room. 42 lights. I started off with 15. I kept adding because it was never bright enough to suit me. 42 lights in the days of incandescent lights was 20-something hundred watts. The air conditioner worked whether it was summer or winter. Fortunately, they changed to fluorescence. I put in those circular fluorescence and the temperature dropped dramatically. Before I left, I had LEDs in everything. Conveniently, I found out that you could match the color from the incandescents to the LEDs, to the fluorescence and the LEDs. And color is a big deal to me because when you're painting your rocks and you're painting your buildings, the colors will clash if you don't paint them under the same colors. At least I think they do. There's James and me admiring the chaos. Well, I think we were admiring the wall being up at that point because it had been raining and I've been working. And it doesn't rain there like it does here. It rains in buckets when it chooses to rain. So all of this stuff would go in here. And these are the actual places I ended up putting. So I widened this to give me more scenery, widened this, connected this. And I also added a little yard, but only 2 or 3 tracks, but I added another industrial area, plus a track that ran along here, crossed the gap, as I'll show you in a later picture, and arrived at what I call my Pacific Northwest section. This had all been kind of a tribute to Colorado, but I wanted that. So I had a 2x8 section over here that got added after. And this was the risers that would bring, these were the supports that would attach the risers that would bring that track over to the Pacific Northwest. And the one down here, the lower one, was the one that was the outside world track. So I built those before I did anything else back here. And then I started laying track back here. Everybody says you can tell my framing because I always tend to use new, shiny, clear wood. And I tend to. My efforts are more expensive to me than my pocketbook a lot of times. Anyway, here it is in print pieces, same picture. Here it is with the improvements or the changes, all filled in. There's the Pacific Northwest. This was a swing up bridge I designed and built and kept because when I moved here, because it worked pretty well. It actually involved toy box hinges, but you could just flip it up, walk through, flip it down, had a connector to turn off trains, and you could duck if you wanted to, but you could also move it in about 10 seconds up and down. So it worked quite well. I had widened the aisles, and the other, in his railroad and James's railroad, they were only 3 feet, well, they were actually 2 feet 9 inches wide. Plus, we had the problem with card boxes and put on a little weight, and you have to get real cozy passing each other. This was 4.5 feet wide. That is a wonderful distance, and this was nearly 5, or right at 5. Much better distance. This was intended to be worked from this side. I put all the controls along this side. But once I started developing this area up here, it was a little hard to see from down here. So what people would do, since you had to walk around throttles, is they'd walk around like this. One guy would stay over here and throw switches, and the other guy was around here running the train. And then I noticed that what this guy liked to go around and back and forth. So I added a second set of controls over here that did the same thing. So these two guys could both come around here and happily run things on this side. So sometimes having, if you got a wide area, putting dual controls, and it's easy enough to do, you just need to use some blocking relays. And I'm always going to do this from now on. I'm going to put an island on my next one. And this is just showing you how I had areas to fill in. I added a lot of reinforcing because it had been attached to walls and really wanted to flex. Put my controls on rollers so I could bring them out and work on them and then shove them back under. Here's where I'm connecting one section to another section with a nice little canyon and a bridge and backdrop behind it. This is the new version of it. But I looked at it as my outside world consisted of two directions, east and west, simply called east and westernness. So trains could come in, work the yard, which now was a pass-through yard. It wasn't an end yard. Work the yard, pick up cars, set cars out, and head off to Easton. Other trains could come in from this side and go this way, doing the same thing. So, or we could send out a local to the Midland industrial area and switch a whole bunch of buildings over there, or head for the mountains. And once you're in the mountains, not only do you get to Summit, which became that little area I added up at the top, but it could go off to Dallas Camp, which is the Pacific Northwest area. A typical night would take us, if somebody brought in a train and went off to this, he could do that in 30 minutes, switching out and so on. Somebody who took off from here and went this way would take 2 hours to make the trip up to here because of all the stuff we had in between. 2 hours up and back, I should say, hour each way. And then I had two shays that worked the Summit to Dallas Camp. This is the beginning of the Pacific Northwest, and this is where the hinge swing up was. I started using Homosote back in the 80s, and I will always use Homosote, except that I now tend to use the Homobid and so on, because there's very few flat places in this world, and I thought, well, you can carve it away, but that takes a lot of trouble. So I don't know if I'll use sheets of Homosote anymore. You can see the basic structure that I use. I attach it to walls, or at least that's what I've done in the past. This was the yard. You walked around the yard into here. Okay, I reached this point. This is, you can see where a lot of the, sorry, I'm using my hand, you can see that, where the add-ins are going on. I'm filling in, I'm painting, I'm adding places to set your coffee cups down, civilizing the whole thing, I call it. I used very simple car cards because I found out nobody ever read them. All they wanted to know was which car and where was it going. So I printed out my own, I made my own and used those, and nobody ever complained about not knowing what was inside. I did paint my backdrops, but I used a lot. All my buildings, except I think 4 over the years, were kits. There was an occasional wandering yellow cow that, or steer that went from place to place. You should have one of those. That's a plastic building. You can weather them to look more backdrop. I tried very hard to make it difficult to see where the 2-dimensional and the 3-dimensional matched. I also like to get the mountains high. I like to feel like I was down in the mountains, not over the mountains. So my backdrops were above eye level. I don't know about Bert. I don't think I can get him higher than him, but we'll see. It's probably hard for you to tell that there's a trout jumping right there, and right over here somewhere, there he is. Can't tell, it is the fisherman, and there's a line running over to him. And it's a 3-dimensional river to here and a 2-dimensional river stream on that side. what's a railroad without a train moving? Let me get, his railroad was the Midland Northwestern, so I left the logo on his engines, the duration. That's a fine scale engine house and water tank and tool shed. You'll notice the track's pretty large. This was just Pico track. It's too large, but I was in a hurry and I never got around to replacing it. A little comment for those of you who think about scenery. This is paint. There's very little three-dimensional green here. Most of this is paint, just dabbed on. If it's 3 feet away, it's very hard to tell. A lot of this paint. That's scratch built. That was his building, not mine. That's Code 100 track. Remember, he started this in the 50s. Code 100 was what was available. Nobody ever commented. Nobody ever complained. Although I will use Code 70. If you have original buildings, this was more original to the style, not original to the anything he had. He hung peppers on it because we saw them in West Texas. Cowboy, got to have that. Here come the sheep. Let me just say something about colors. I think that my colors are too strong. I intended it that way. Backdrops and things seem to get washed out in a lot of paint. That's a Bragdon. That's one casting, that mountain. Everything you can see there. I played with it. Also, you kind of run color through it, and it makes, even if it's not stratified rock, showing you where the area was that everybody walked into and wanted to run trains. And so they just walked around. Now that one's kind of narrow, but they didn't have to go there. Go the other way was the Pacific Northwest. I had one of my counselors down there and the other one's right next to him. I wanted to see that fog in the clouds thing that you see a lot of around here. I'm sorry I've run over time. I did not intend to do that. But here's what I mean about the colors being kind of strong. It looks good in the real thing, and I like that. Here's somebody who's Bob Lydecker and Danny Cryer. Some of you may know them. We're in the alley working the trains, and it's only 2 feet wide, and they were laughing about the fact that they couldn't pass each other. The ultimate purpose is the people, to me, not the train. And they were getting this view, which is a really neat view. I always put at least one storm on my backdrops. And I'm just running through these. I'll be glad to show them slower. So we decided to move. A number of people said, well, are you going to move the train again? I actually thought about it, priced it, but I just didn't know if I'd have room to put it here. So this was taken apart. So let me take just a few minutes with this. I have my givens, but they're the same as they were: logging, mining, mountain, streams, lots of switching. I've added this because I don't know that I will stay here. We had never seen this house before we moved into it, other than in pictures. So I'm making it modular. I will have sections that I can take apart. LEDs are new these days. I'm going to have the strips that run around it. 4,000 degrees matches the colors of my painting. I'm not going to have any duck unders. I'm going to limit the reach. Don't tell me that you can reach 30 inches. If you have a derailed car or a switch that needs fixing, you better have long arms. I'm going to stick to Code 70, use Homosote, fast track switches. Which slow motion switch machines? I like the Walters ones that have come out. I'm probably thinking that way. Whether or not I'll use uncouplers, I haven't decided. But these are all my choices that I'm making during the time. I've been here for 2 years. I haven't built. I moved into this place. I saw what I called the train room. They called it some type of a heating room. And I don't know why anybody would waste a garage on these things. But anyway, this became my workshop, a little bit of storage. I'm going to build in here. I've taken time building because I had to get a lot of things done before that. But this is where I'm going to build. If I need to expand, I can expand. I can expand into over 700 square feet. This is my workshop. I had it built, taken care of in 5. That's that little alcove over here. I took care of that in the first week I was here because I have to work on things. Can't stand it. Here's the new track plan. There's the alcove. It's got an outside world connection, sorting, can send things back out. One track comes around and goes to the mining and logging, and the other track goes to the industrial area. Very similar pattern to before, but it's what I like. And there it is. I've got it graphed out. I'm going to offer a few things. Steam's hard to run. It's harder to keep things on the track. I like steam, but I recommend people go with diesels if that's what they like. Yards, Ys, and turntables, great for operation, but you got to have room for them. I have room for a yards and turntables. I don't have room for a Y. Building and street lighting. I've never lit my railroad above. I may or may not, haven't decided. Really think about this one. Don't give yourself 18 inches and 22 inches for a clearance when you got to walk around. You'll be sorry. Get your overhead lighting figured out and try and get the color to all match. I'm talking about your tube lights and your layout lights. They're not the same thing. And I don't care what color you use, whether you use 3,000 or 5,000, you pick it. But try and use the same thing and paint your buildings and your scenery with those lights on so that the colors will match. Otherwise, you'll have some problems. To me, the first one is critical. Why are you building a railroad? Are you doing it just because of what you want? Are you trying to entertain the grandkids? You just like to watch trains run? You don't need much switching, or do you want lots of switching like I did? I will watch trains run, but I love to switch cars. Nothing makes me happier than having a 6-car train and only a 4-car passing siding. I've got to juggle things to get that around. Why I build, though, is because I like the people. I like you crazy people that come to these sessions, and I've met things, and they're creative, and it's just a lot of fun. And model railroading has got numerous ways to have your creativity. Now, how big? You decide, but remember about maintenance, folks. I know a guy, he's got 2,000 square feet, and he wants to fill it with train. And I say, well, how many people are you going to have to help you? Well, he lives out in Arizona, not anywhere near anybody I can tell. So I don't know who's going to fix that thing. Build it and they will come. How old are you? How mobile? How healthy? Ask yourself those questions. And prepare the room. If you want displays, I just like train in mine. But you want one side to be pictures and so on? Fine, just figure it out before you start building the railroad. I appreciate you listening. Plan, think about it. I have watched far too many YouTubes and blogs and wasted time, and I finally realized I could watch them work on the trains at the same time. But the important thing is keep moving, don't stop, work on it. And I gave you my connection numbers, and I would love to come see what you're doing. And when I have something, I will be glad to show it to you. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was marvelous. Very, very interesting.
Good.
And it shows that you don't have to have a layout to give a layout tour for the 4th Division second Saturdays.
Your article was in RMC in 96, I
Yes,
believe you said?
August, I think. Yeah, that's the only one I ever submitted for publication. I'm glad you noticed that. I'd forgotten.
I think I remember reading it, actually.
Oh, boy, you've got a memory then.
Yeah.
Hey, Tom.
I liked your scenery and your backdrops.
Thank you very much.
Tom, you talked about color a couple times, strong color, and I never quite followed why you said that.
Okay.
Why strong color?
It's more just an aesthetic thing that when I paint it natural color, and then I take pictures of it, or even I just look at it, it all kind of blends together. But when I make the colors just a little bit brighter, a little bit harsher, The yellow's a little yellower, the brown's a little browner. It seems to look better. It's an aesthetic thing. I can only suggest that somebody try it. Take a light yellow and then put a darker yellow across it. And the darker yellow just seems to give me more to look at. Commercial backdrops, printed ones, a lot of those, particularly when you take pictures of them, they kind of get lost in the lighting.
And kind of bland.
Yeah.
And
And the same thing happens with painted backdrops, except if I overpaint, maybe I'm a little stronger, a little harsher, a little brighter, and I take pictures, they come through better in the pictures. And that's what you're seeing right now.
Thanks. That's really interesting.
So it's one of those things. I'm not an artist by training. I'm an artist by experimentation.
Right.
I have wasted much more paint than I've ever used.
We have a question on the chat. Why don't you like tortoises?
Okay, that's an aesthetic thing. Number one, they take couple of seconds to go. I know that doesn't sound like much, but if I got several, I'm flipping. Whereas I was used to
Instant gratification.
I used to the instant gratification of
Mhm.
a twin coil. The Walters are adjustable. You can adjust the speed from like half a second to 4 or 5 seconds. So you can play with it. Plus they come with a stronger wire. And anybody who's had tortoises has replaced the wires.
Right.
There's another thing, and this is almost, I had a couple of tortoises when I had all those. Oh, and I sold them. I didn't come out. But anyway, that actually failed. And so I took them apart, as I do when things, and I found out that the sliders inside were not contacting every time. Now it was only 2 out of maybe 50, but still it was 2. And once you put them under the table, they're inconvenient. So I actually opened up all the ones I had and modified them so that wouldn't happen.
Did you write about that in one of the magazines? I know I saw someone recently say that there's a thing you could do to prevent a future problem with tortoises.
Well, the thing is, it's a little bit of trouble, and most people are not going to do it just because you got to crawl under the table, have somebody help you line it up, and so on. So,
Right.
And the contacts are a sliding contact. Someday sliding contacts wear, and I don't know how long that's going to take. And I've worked on my friend James's layout, was 60 years old by the time I left Midland, and it was still working fine with twin coil machines.
I have a question about James's layout. The upper town in the back, was that against the wall, so you were reaching a very long way to work it?
Yeah. Well, you didn't have to work it. It had permanent magnets. We had remote switch machines, and there was access. You had to go up through a mountain and you could get to stuff, or you could remove a lake.
But you didn't do that normally when you were running trains, did you?
No, you ran it from the aisle. You had switch machines down there, and it worked that way. And we had a little false uncoupling on the magnet.
Sure.
But you learned it. That was one of the things that newcomers always had trouble with, was permanent magnets on. Well, our mountain railroad, you constantly have elevation changes.
Right.
Cars will bunch up and uncouple when you don't want them. And I think that's why so many people use skewers.
Yeah, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, a lot of those track plans were very wide spaghetti bowls like you're describing.
Right.
And people used the remote uncoupling and the switch machines to do the work without touching the trains.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've just gotten used to walk around throttles and narrower bench work.
Right. No, I wouldn't go back, but but the moment I had access to the back, I created
a whole new town.
Yeah, a new town and new track and new controls and so on. All of it with a much easier reach. So
that's wonderful. Yeah, that's great.
That's what I'm going to do.
Are there any other questions from the group?
I would just comment, on my layout with COVID, I hadn't really operated for about 2.5 years. And so a lot of my tortoises hadn't been operated during that time. And I'm sure a little bit of not corrosion, but what oxidation on those contacts had formed. And so some of the switch machines were difficult to operate initially. So I recommend routinely on your layout, just going through and throwing every turnout about every 2 weeks, just to kind of keep it flexible.
Well, we all know that, or we all should know that running your train is the best way to keep your railroad working.
Yeah.
So run it, find that siding that you never go to and run something out there. And,
Thank you very much, Tom. That was an excellent presentation, and I know we all enjoyed it very much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed doing it.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Bill, do you have any announcements for the group? Or Greg, do you want to talk about your clinic? Oh, you're muted. Bill, you're muted.
The Olympia Clinic was last night. We did it a week earlier.
Right. And was it good?
Yeah, we had a fun time. Scott presented our trip down to the steam up in Virginia City and Carson City, and it got recorded. So in a week or two, it will be up, and you can take a look at all the pictures. Scott did a lot of research on all the V&T engines. He had worked at the museum in the 80s down there, and so it was really a fun trip for him, and he knew everything about everything.
Great. Bill?
Just a reminder that a lot of us are going to be at the Washington State History Museum for 16 days over the Christmas vacation. So come on down, say hi, see all the layouts. A lot of the modular groups will be there, and the Boeing Club will be there. So it's a good place to come during the holidays.
That sounds like fun. Any other clinic present
Yeah,
announcements?
we have the East Side Clinic this Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. And we'll feature a couple of things, Lee Marsh and looks like maybe Max McGinnis and a couple others will share some things about what's on your workbench.
All right, with that, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month. It'll be a new year, and I don't know what we're going to see, but I'm sure it'll be good. Goodbye, everyone. Have much fun with trains.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Yep.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Yeah.
Absolutely.